South Africa is very much an integral part of the international world of civil aviation. 24 foreign airlines maintain regular services between this country and destinations overseas. Numerous domestic carriers provide a local service, and South Africa's national airline now flies to all 6 continents of the globe. Things have come a long way in the last half-century, and much of the progress is due to the pioneering vision of Major Alistair McIntosh Miller, better known to his friends as a man called Mac. South African civil aviation really goes back to 1909, to this windswept field near East London. On the 28th of December that year, Albert Kimmerling made his historic flight in the Flying Matchbox, the first heavier-than-air powered aircraft to fly in this country. The event took place only 6 years after the Wright brothers had first flown at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. (1911), and John Weston establishes his Western Aviation Company and forms the Aeronautical Society. Soon, the daring airmen were thrilling crowds all over the country with these breathtaking demonstration flights. Almost overnight, aviation fever swept the land. In all 4 provinces, motorized flying machines were being put together in barns and backyards. The spirit of adventure was intense. The frontier of the sky was about to be conquered. The magic of flight was being discovered. So, resourceful men dreamt their dreams and made their plans, and the new method of transportation, in the form of the aeroplane, took proudly and confidently to the air. Enthralling excited crowds in Johannesburg, the Frenchman Raison and his local partner, C.J. Bradell. December the 27th, 1911, and Evelyn Driver flies the first airmail delivery between Kenilworth and Muizenberg, the startling distance of 5 kilometers. Three years later, the world went to war, and a new role was found for the flying machine. Transcending the gulf between experiment and implementation, it became a fighting machine. For the first time in history, man took his battles into the sky. In South Africa, a military flying school is established to train pilots for the Royal Flying Corps. In charge of the recruitment campaign, the distinguished flying ace, Alistair McIntosh Miller. Many applications for training were received, including one from C.J. Fenter, who would later become a general and ultimately chief executive of the country's national airline. Another applicant, the young aviator Reinhold Kasparuthus. As for Alistair Miller, fate and destiny would take him beyond a military career, but that lay a decade in the future. 1920, and the South African Air Force comes into being. Selected as its first commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Pierre van Reineveld. That same year, he and Quentin Brand astound the world. In their converted Vickers Vimy bomber, the Silver Queen, they fly from England to Cairo. A second aircraft takes them as far as Bulawayo, where they arrive a month later. Intending to continue on to Cape Town, disaster struck. Fortunately, both men are unhurt, and South Africa sends up a replacement aircraft, Voortrekker, a de Havilland 9. The resilient aviators reach Cape Town and inscribe their names in history as the first travelers to cross Africa by air. 1925, and the now Sir Pierre van Ryneveld applies the young Air Force to a new task, the introduction of an experimental airmail service. The cost of sending a letter? 6pence per ounce. A popular novelty at first, the service did not last long. In 1930, the adventure of aviation was all-pervasive, and record-breaking flights were in vogue. How fast, for example, can one fly from London to South Africa? Reinhold Kasparuthis seizes the challenge.
Well, there's not an awful lot to say about that effort. Several pilots in South Africa had already undertaken the flight and broken the record, and I thought that I would like to have a crack at it too. It was a de Havilland Pushmoth. It was a high-wing monoplane with a gypsy engine of 120 horsepower. Well, my average speed to Cape Town was about 105 miles per hour. The total flight time was 76 hours over a period of 8.5 days. It was customary for the record breakers to name their aircraft, so I decided to name mine Springbok, which seems to be quite appropriate at this time.
1932. London is at the centre of a thriving British Empire, and Imperial Airways commences scheduled flights to South Africa. Long-distance air travel had arrived. But what about South Africa itself and the young Alistair Miller? Van Ryneveld, Brand, Kasparuthis, and many other trailblazers inspired his vision and his dreams. He was filled with an intense desire to see aviation established as a viable commercial enterprise. 3 years before Imperial Airways first droned across South Africa's skies, Miller forms the country's first airline. July the 24th, 1929, and Union Airways comes into being. With a small staff, a capital of £5,000, and the Atlantic Refining Company as a minor partner, Miller secures an annual government contract for the transport of mail. The routes were designed to link coastal cities with inland areas, drastically shortening the time taken for postal deliveries. Miller chose only the best pilots to fly for his new airline, including Reinhold Kasparuthis. Also selected for his youthful enthusiasm and keenness, Fred Egling.
Port Elizabeth was our base, and we flew to Cape Town to pick up the mail, back to Port Elizabeth, and from Port Elizabeth the mail was taken to Johannesburg via Bloemfontein and to Durban via East London.
The service was run during the winter months, and the weather conditions at the time were pretty foul. But we managed to get through and never missed the outgoing mail ship, which sailed from Cape Town at 4 o'clock every Friday afternoon. We also collected the incoming mail teamer's mail and flew it up the coast. Union Airways in 1929 was a truly commercial effort by Major Miller. We did get a subsidy of £8,000, which was very a small amount, but we managed to make the service a very proven one. It was exciting and even romantic.
Towards the end of 1929, Union Airways takes delivery of what was then the last word in modern aircraft, a Fokker Super Universal, specially imported from the United States. Built primarily to carry passengers, the large machine was more than what was needed for the airmail service. But it joined the fleet and became Miller's pride and joy. The introduction of passenger flights is what he really dreamt about. That was always his greatest desire. January the 29th, 1930. His license granted and passenger-carrying flights become a reality. The flying time from Port Elizabeth's Fairview Racecourse to Cape Town would take 3 hours and 20 minutes. The cost of a return ticket, £18. The comfortable plane became popular, but unfortunately, it did not survive for very long. December the 31st, 1931. With no passengers on board, the aircraft sets out on a postal flight.
Well, we had left East London on the way to Port Elizabeth, and we came across impossible conditions, and Major Miller took over the aircraft. I was flying the craft at the time. I indicated that I thought that we should turn back. So Major Miller came up to the front, and we tried to get through this terrific veil of mist, and there was a lot of thunder in this sort of weather. Suddenly, there was a flash of lightning, and the controls became ineffective. Completely useless. You could swing the stick around as much as you liked and nothing happened. And Major Miller just told me to get behind, and we hit the ground. Fortunately, most of the crash was taken up by the engine and one of the wings. But we managed to get out. We popped out like popcorn, as a matter of fact. And the main tank had been burst, the main petrol tank. And petrol was spewing all over the place, and it was also falling onto the engine, and the engine was spitting. And all three of us realized at the same time that the mail bags were still inside the plane. So we all dived in again. We all got into each other's ways, but anyhow, we got the mail out.
Undaunted by the crash, Miller replaces the Fokker with Junker's F-13 aircraft. Passenger services are increased, and despite a generally widespread public fear of the new method of transportation, the company does attract a certain amount of business. One of the first passengers to brave the skies, Bill Slater.
I was coming from Joburg to Durban to spend the weekend with my fiancée, who, of course, is now my wife. And I went into all the ramifications of flying. It was quite simple. All I had to do was to go to the Rand Airport and buy a ticket and book my seat on a Junkers. On the appointed day, I went out to Rand Airport and climbed into the aeroplane. There were about 5 of us, including a woman with a dog. The first thing the dog did was to rush into a corner and bury itself. However, we came to the taking off part, and we rushed across the rough veldt, and we went off on the edge of the hill into the air. It was quite an exciting thing for me because I had never flown before, and I should think that very few people at that particular time had flown before. And the pilot gave one great confidence because his conversation was designed to encourage us to be brave, you see. However, there was lots of bumping over the Drakensberg. It took 3.5 hours. It was most interesting to see the reactions of other people because I think that all the people in the plane had flown for the first time. And when I looked around, I saw signs of doubt and encouragement on the faces of these people. When we were coming into land, both airports, there was a spirit of extreme happiness and everybody was laughing. But while we were up in the air, it wasn't so encouraging. The whole atmosphere of flying was an atmosphere of, aren't you afraid? Or, my goodness me, what if that plane crashed? And only a little while ago, there was a lady visited us here who remembered saying, and I don't remember, I was in the church choir in Joburg, and she was, and she said, "Fancy, you're going to fly to Durban to see your fiancé. Goodness me, we'll pray for you, all right." Such was the element of risk that most people attached to flying.
But what sort of a man was Major Miller?
Major Miller was an outstanding man. He was small, very energetic, and a terrific sense of humor.
Major Miller was an outstanding pioneer of our aviation history, and I only have the highest regard for his efforts in the development of commercial aviation in this country.
I was very fond of him. I think we all were very fond of Major Miller. He was hardworking, and it became obvious that it must have taken a lot out of him, because when he stayed with us at Germiston, it was obvious that he was absolutely exhausted at times. He did a lot of his work while flying in the cabin with books and so on.
Economic conditions at the time were at least at a low ebb. And although we did get a subsidy from the government to operate the service, it didn't cover the costs. Also, there were a very apathetic public at the time, resulted in poor support, and the amount of mail carried was very, very small indeed.
The German Junkers Aircraft Company, owners of Southwest African Airways, come to Miller's financial aid, and Hupfner, manager of the Windhoek-based airline, becomes joint managing director of Union Airways. More staff and aircraft were added to Miller's fleet, but things were not in his favor. A series of fatal accidents deals the company a mortal blow. Financially, the airline had become bankrupt. With cap in hand, Miller approaches the government. After all he had accomplished, he was reticent to liquidate his airline, to see everything he'd achieved disappear. Perhaps the state could help. Negotiations were successful. All his assets and liabilities were taken over. And so it was that on the 1st of February 1934, South African Airways came into being. The Flying Springbok had been born. The new airline was placed under the responsibility of the state-owned railways. Additional funds, staff and equipment were added, and from its base at Durban, the enterprise got underway. A man associated with it from the very beginning, Jeff Scott.
It goes right back to 1934, when I was stationed in Durban as a traffic clerk. And in those early days, Durban was the headquarters of South African Airways. And we had Mr. Lindenberg was then our superintendent, staff and technical. Major Miller was then our operational superintendent. Mr. Summerton was the air station supervisor, and I was the traffic clerk. But in that building that we were housed, it was so cramped that my little office in the corner on my desk was also used for the tea table. So I got the carpenter to make me a dummy top, and I had this fixed to a pulley in the roof. And when the girls wanted to make their tea, I used to pull this whole thing up to the roof. And Mr. Lindenberg used that little corner to show the people how cramped they were for space in this Heath Robinson contraption of mine, how it worked. And in 1935, they moved to the reef.
Originally ordered by Alistair Miller, Junkers Ju-52 aircraft were about to modernize the fleet. The first machine to be flown out from the factory was under the command of the distinguished German pilot, Hans Bohr.
The
Ju-52 aircraft first came out in January 1932.
I was with Lufthansa in Munich at the time. These aircraft were intended for use on the Alpine flights because our other aircraft could not reach the necessary altitude. With these machines, we could fly as high as 5,500 meters, which was what we required. The aircraft could accommodate 17 passengers and acquired a good reputation all over the world. In 1937, they were ordered by South Africa, and my flight out was very interesting. During the day, we covered an average distance of between 1,300 and 1,500 kilometers, a limit imposed by the maximum amount of fuel which we could carry. We had enough on board for about a 4.5-hour flight. It took 11 days for the complete trip to Johannesburg. When I eventually arrived in Johannesburg, I was greeted most cordially by everyone, especially by the German colony there. The airport itself was exactly as an airport should be, and the field was well looked after. There were proper hangars and facilities, and it was exactly as any modern airport that one would find in Germany or anywhere else. It was really a very nice airport.
Es war ein Flughafen, wo man sagen, genau wie in Deutschland auch gut gepflegter und versorgter Flughafen.
Rand Airport became the aerial gateway to the country, for the overseas service operated by Imperial Airways and for the growing national airline, South African Airways. Air travel had become safe, reliable and respectable, and gained the confidence of the public. Rand Airport became the hub of it all. A little undignified, perhaps, but in those days a lady had to reveal her weight in public.
Control tower calling. Control tower calling. Will all passengers by South African Airways aircraft for Cape Town kindly take their seats? Zal alle passagiers wat uit Zuid-Afrika en Zuid-Afrikaanse vliegtuig tot Kaapstad reis, alsjeblieft hou zitplekken innemen.
Named after the early governors of the Cape and Natal colonies, the venerable Junkers aircraft would become as familiar as the steam train and the car, serving the country faithfully and reliably.
Okay, start the starboard engine.
The young airline, the airline of the flying Springbok, would soon play its part in the development of the country's growing economy and would wing its way into becoming the largest airline on the African continent and ultimately one of the great airlines of the world.